Every inch of its head had been tattooed with an intricate grid, and at every intersection of horizontal and vertical axes a jeweled pin driven through to the bone. Its tongue was similarly decorated.
In this movie brew, we're going to talk about 1987's Clive Barker's Hellraiser, starring Ashley Lawrence as Kirsty Cotton, Claire Higgins as Julia Cotton, Andrew Robinson as Larry Cotton, and Sean Chapman as Frank Cotton. And that rounds out the Cotton family. Oliver Smith was the skinless Frank, or sometimes referred to as Frank the Monster. And then for the Cenobites, we had Grace Kirby as the female Cenobite, Simon Bamford as the Butterball Cenobite, Nicholas Vance as the Chattering Cenobite, and finally Doug Bradley as the lead Cenobite. Clive Barker, who wrote screenplays for Underworld and Rawhead Rex, the latter of which was based upon Barker's own short story of the same name, was displeased, to say the least, with how his material was handled. Rawhead Rex in particular was drastically different from the source material, and if given the chance, I highly suggest reading Barker's Books of Blood, which contains stories such as Rawhead Rex, The Midnight Meat Train, and many more. Barker decided that he was to direct the next film based on his work to conserve the vision that he had. That next film happened to be Hellraiser, based upon Barker's novella The Hellbound Heart. Also, read this too if you get a chance. Barker was introduced to Chris Figg through mutual friends, and Figg wanted to be a producer while Barker wanted to direct a movie. The mutual friend, Alan Parker, not to be confused with the filmmaker of the same name, provided the two with some capital when a package was created with a script and some images that Barker had drawn. The duo was off to meet with different production companies, the first of which was New World Pictures. As luck would have it, New World was on board with the concept and said yes to the pitch. Armed with a budget of $1 million, they set off to put the pieces together for one of the best horror movies ever made. Assembling a team that consisted of Bob Keane and Jeff Portis at Image Animation for practical effects and initial designs on the Cenobites, and Jane Wildgoose, who was brought in as a costume designer. They started with some designs for the 4 to 5 Cenobites that were supposed to be in the movie. Jane Wildgoose was also supposed to refine the scarification process in designs that Image Animation had came up with. Wildgoose has stated that her notes read as follows. Clive wanted 1. Areas of revealed flesh where some kind of torture has or is occurring, and 2. Something associated with butchery involved. They should also be magnificent super butchers. There would be 1 or 2 of them with some hangers-on, as he put it, and that there would be 4 or 5 altogether. Some of the actors cast were people that Barker knew. Nicholas Vince, for instance, lived near Barker, and Barker suggested that they should work together as he was a fan of Vince's work. Simon Bamford was introduced to Barker through a friend who was doing prop work for Barker's plays. Bamford and Barker became friends, and Bamford joined Barker's theater company. After the company disbanded, Bamford asked what Barker was working on, to which he replied, Hellraiser. Doug Bradley, who had a choice between playing the lead Cenobite and one of the movers in the film, was friends with Barker from secondary school and worked with Barker on various projects since they had met. The search for an actress to portray Kirsty was slightly more difficult. Jennifer Tilly had auditioned, but they didn't really find anybody they liked until they came upon Ashley Lawrence, who apparently at her audition was told, Your uncle is in your father's skin. He's trying to kill you and have sex with you. In that order, go. So she cold read, and then was asked if she would read, or if she would go to England and read with Doug Bradley. There were some problems during filmmaking. The creature that would later be called the Engineer was difficult to work with mechanically. Doug Bradley had a hard time hitting his marks due to the contact lenses he was supposed to be wearing, and he was afraid of tripping over the skirts on the costume. And a scene at a Chinese restaurant with Kirsty and Andrew Robinson's character, Larry, was a rush shoot due to the film crew being let into the restaurant fairly late in the day. Some things, as with all book-to-film transitions, were changed. In The Hellbound Heart, Larry and Kirsty are not father and daughter. They were friends, and Kirsty was in love with Larry, who actually in the book was named Rory. Pinhead, I hate calling him that, was not really the lead Cenobite, and much of his dialogue in the film was actually divided up between all the Cenobites that were in the novel. The Cenobite genders were more ambiguous in the novella, too. A passage from the book reads, Its clothes, some of which were sewn to and through the skin, hid its private parts, and there was nothing in the dregs of its voice or in its willfully disfigured features that offered the least clue. There are some other minor changes, but for the most part the film follows the novella pretty closely. None of the changes really impact the experience, and if anything, making Kirsty the daughter of Larry makes the family drama much better, and it makes the ending with that much more creepier when Frank's intentions are revealed. In the music department, Barker had originally wanted industrial band Coil to compose the soundtrack for the film, but New World was against the idea, and Christopher Young was brought in to score the film, at the recommendation of one of the editors, Tony Randall. The film score has been praised and criticized. Some people feel it's bland, others feel it matches with what's going on screen perfectly. I am in the latter camp. I particularly enjoy Young's score for this movie. Barker has spoken fondly of the experience of making the film, stating his memories were of unalloyed fondness. The cast treated my ineptitudes kindly, and the crew were no less forgiving. After filming, the story was relocated to the United States, so overdubbing was required to remove some of the British accents. Originally, Doug Bradley's voice was going to be overdubbed by an American actor until the decision was made that his performance was just too good to overdub. The MPAA came down hard on the film, and many cuts were needed to get the film down from an X rating. Shots were removed from Julia's murders of the men that she brings to Frank. A close-up of Kirsty putting her hand in Frank's stomach and exposing his organs was removed. And a longer version exists of Frank being torn apart by the Cenobite's chains. They also cut the flashback scene with Julia and Frank. Barker had told Sam Hain magazine in 1987, "While we did have a slight problem with the eroticism, I shot a much hotter flashback sequence than they would allow us to cut in. Mine was more explicit and less violent. They wanted to substitute one kind of undertow for another. I had a much more explicit sexual encounter between Frank and Julia, but they said no. Let's take out the sodomy and put in the flick knife." Barker also states that on the commentary for the film that we did a version of this scene which had some spanking in it. The MPAA was not very appreciative of that. Lord knows where the spanking footage is. Somebody has it somewhere. The MPAA told me I was allowed 2 consecutive buttock thrusts from Frank, but 3 is deemed obscene. The film opens with Frank Cotton in Morocco buying a puzzle box before we cut to Frank sitting in the attic and solving the box. Hook chains shoot out from it, and we get a glimpse of some of Frank's torture before being shown the attic room filled with chains and pieces of Frank strewn about. A Cenobite picks up the box and returns it to its original arrangement. This act restores the room to normal. Sometime later, Frank's brother Larry and his wife Julia move into the house. Larry's trying to work on his relationship, which is strained with his wife Julia. Larry's daughter Kirsty from his first marriage is also introduced in the scene, and she has chosen to get her own place rather than to live with Larry and Julia. Julia explores the house, and while in the attic it is revealed in flashbacks that she had an affair with Frank. Larry, while helping the movers, cuts his hand on a nail. He goes into the attic room where Julia is, and while they talk, his blood is dripping on the floor. The blood on the floorboards ends up resurrecting Frank, though he is skinless and decrepit looking. This scene is incredibly visceral, and it's not what we almost got into the final film. Originally, a dried-up corpse was supposed to grow out from the wall, but Barker and effects designer Bob Keane didn't like the effect. They reshot the sequence using a reverse shot of a red substance being pumped up through the nail holes in the floor. Then a small red sac being filled with air from underneath the floorboards to represent Frank's embryonic state. Porridge was then pumped through small holes in the floor to simulate the goo that comes up through, and 2 animatronic arms then burst through. A good portion of the scenes are reverse photography of wax models of Frank's various body parts melting or having body parts pulled away by wires. but when reversed it appears as if the body is growing and being reassembled. This effect still looks incredible even to this day, and it's sad to think that if it was done now it would probably be CGI. Julia finds Frank, who uses her obsession with him to get her to bring bodies to him to harvest to restore his own body. Julia begins picking up men at bars and bringing them to the house to murder them, where Frank then consumes them. Frank explains to Julia the puzzle box and how it would open a portal to a realm of carnal pleasures never before experienced, and how when he solved it the Cenobites came and subjected him to extreme sadomasochism. Kirsty witnesses Julia bringing men into the house and suspects that she's having an affair. Following her, she interrupts Frank while he is draining a corpse. At this point, Frank decides to attack her, but Kirsty throws the puzzle box out of a window, causing enough of a distraction to escape. She retrieves the box but passes out shortly thereafter while walking through the city. Waking up in a hospital, Kirsty solves the box, summoning first a creature called the Engineer. After barely escaping it, the Cenobites arrive.
The box. You opened it. We came.
It's just a puzzle box!
Oh no. It is a means to summon us.
Who are you?
Explorers in the further regions of experience. Demons to some, angels to others.
The lead Cenobite explains what they are and attempt to take Kirsty with them, but she informs them that Frank has escaped. Skeptical that anybody could escape their grasp, the lead Cenobite agrees to take Frank, and in exchange will consider sparing Kirsty. However, they need to hear Frank confess who he is and his escape.
I want to hear him confess himself. Then, maybe... But if you cheat us, we'll tear your soul apart.
Kirsty returns to the cotton house where Frank has killed Larry and is wearing his skin. Julia shows Kirsty the skinned corpse in the attic, claiming it to be that of Frank's. The Cenobites appear and are not thrilled, to say the least.
We want the man who did this.
Kirsty attempts to escape but is stopped by Frank and Julia. Frank reveals the truth to Kirsty, and when she rejects his sexual advances, decides that he'll use her to complete his resurrection. In the scuffle, he accidentally stabs Julia on the steps, stating it's nothing personal, and then drains her body. Frank continues to pursue Kirsty, eventually ending up in the attic. As he's about to kill her, he says enough about himself to convince the Cenobites of his true identity.
Your dear old Uncle Frank. What the hell is that?
Realizing he's been tricked by Kirsty, he makes an attempt to kill her but is stopped by the hooked chains of the Cenobites. More and more chains appear and attach to Frank, and just before he's ripped apart, he looks at Kirsty and says,
Jesus wept.
The original scripted line was "fuck off," but Andrew Robinson didn't like the line and ad-libbed the Jesus wept line. As Kirsty attempts to leave, she encounters each Cenobite one by one. Having recovered the box from Julia's corpse, she begins banishing each Cenobite by reversing the motions used to solve the box. Kirsty's boyfriend Steve shows up and helps her escape the collapsing house. Outside, Kirsty throws the box into the fire of the house before seeing a homeless man that has been stalking her throughout the movie walk into the fire and retrieve the box before turning into a skeletal dragon-like creature and flying off. The film ends with the merchant from the beginning of the movie selling the box to another customer. And that is Hellraiser. It's high on my list of not just favorite horror movies, but movies in general. This is a movie that, especially when it came out, nothing like it had ever really been seen. It deviates from traditional horror films of the 80s in that it's not a slasher film, nor is it a movie about evil satanic monsters, really. Hellraiser is a movie about people who no longer are satisfied with their lives and seek to find some sort of satisfaction, whether it be physical or emotional. Frank has exhausted all of his sensory experiences, and Julia is resentful and unhappy with her marriage to Larry, only feeling desperate for love with Frank. The Cenobites are not mindless killers. They are impartial creatures who do not care about the morality of those they take with them. Their task is simple. You summon them, they subject you to their pleasures. They are creatures that have been subjected to experiences so beyond what we as humans can understand, and they have no difference between pleasure and pain. Their motivations are not driven by anything other than fulfilling what they believe to be the reason a person would solve the puzzle box. Later sequels to this movie would turn Doug Bradley's lead Cenobite into the focal point of the franchise, and most egregiously, Hellraiser 3 and 4 especially, would reduce him to a common horror movie villain, not that dissimilar from a slasher movie antagonist. Mistakes made in the sequels is shifting the focus to the Cenobites, when the focus should be on the human characters. This movie sets Larry, Frank, Julia, and Kirsty as individuals. We get to know them and their personalities. And even for the little amount of time that Frank is on screen before all hell breaks loose, we basically know and understand who he is and what his motivations are. The film does suffer from some problems, most notably and most obviously the redubbing of Frank's lines. It stands out and is somewhat inconsistent at times. New World decided after filming to switch the film's setting from England to a nondescript American town, and by redubbing some of the lines it just doesn't fit, and it's really obvious. And while it doesn't destroy the experience of the film, it's something that can be distracting and something that has always kind of bothered me about the movie. On the flip side of that though, Doug Bradley's lines, while not overdubbed by a different actor, had effects added to them in post-production that makes for a truly creeping and disconcerting feel. He speaks elegantly, but the effects used on his voice make it ominous and remove any hint of humanity from the character, making him truly feel like an extra-dimensional creature that has stepped into our plane of existence. The ending has some poorly done visuals, and Barker has admitted it was mostly due to the inexperience and low budget of the film. Again, while not ruining the experience, it does stand out as quite bad considering how good the rest of the film looks. While gory, it never feels like gore for the sake of gore. Everything is purposely done to unsettle and disturb the viewer, and it does. Frank's resurrection is a scene that just looks agonizing. And the scenes where the hook chains are ripping into Frank's skin, I mean, you can feel it. It looks painful. And even the shot at the end with the large hook going into his spine to this day still makes me squirm a little bit in my chair. What further separates Hellraiser from films of the time like House or Fright Night is the ambitiousness the film has in its themes. The moral and emotional complexity of this film isn't something that is generally in horror films. And the blending of what can be considered a soap opera drama, sex, and visceral horror could have gone wrong and been a disaster on many levels. Considering this is Clive Barker's directorial debut, and that the film turned out as well as it did, even with the aforementioned problems, and it's certainly far better than, say, Stephen King's directorial debut, Maximum Overdrive, I have to give you a recommendation that you should watch this film. If you haven't seen it, pick up a copy and give it a watch. And if you're into books, I highly suggest reading The Hellbound Heart and The Scarlet Gospels also.
What's your pleasure, sir?